Great, I think we'll kick off. Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today, particularly given the train strikes in London. I think it's great to see so many of you here. Really looking forward to the session today. My name's Kevin O'Flynn, and we're here to talk about the future of supply planning. I'm joined by my two colleagues, Shabbir and Steve, and I'll let them introduce themselves.
Thanks, Kevin. Good morning to everybody. Hope you're having a good time. My name is Shabbir Ahmed, and I work for Replan. I'm a planner, so I'm not a techie. You know, I've been planning more or less all my life, actually. So I worked at these sort of companies, some of these anyway, but I was, just a bit of highlights, I was at British Sugar, Associated British Foods as a planning manager. At Kellogg's, I was there for about 10 years, ran their Europe-wide S&OP process for 4 years. I was at Tate & Lyle Sugars, and I see a couple of colleagues from Tate & Lyle actually, so go easy on me, boys. Also at Action & Bell, I was the head of planning there. I actually met Steve at Coca-Cola, where I was the head of planning, and he was the head of ops, you know, and as you can imagine, planning and ops are kind of strange bedfellows at loggerheads historically, and I'm really pleased to be here to talk about how we work better together.
Yeah, thank you, Shabbir. So Steve Adams. I started life at Associated British Foods as well. I did a 4.5-year engineering apprenticeship. I left there and went to Diageo, where I was a production manager for 5 production lines. Fortunate enough to do the Diageo senior leadership program there. And then I joined the Coca-Cola system in 2000. And originally I was in the Edmonton factory, which is a large manufacturing site in North London. And that was a turnaround job, so you know that was quite a lot of heavy lifting. But that factory went on to win Cranfield Best Factory Award in 2004. And I spent 21 very good years in Coca-Cola. Managed to see quite a lot of the world, spent a lot of time across Europe, over in the States, Japan, Australia. And I did all sorts of things, everything from running single factories to, when Shabbir was there, I was running all the GB factories at that point in time. And then I did multiple transformation projects, and a little bit about what we'll touch on today is transformation. Multiple transformation projects. And then the last 5 years, I worked for CCEP. I was the vice president for the end-to-end supply chain, so running the end-to-end supply chain. And then in 2021, I made quite a big decision to leave after 21 great years in the Coke system, and mainly to spend more time with my family, which has kind of worked out. Not quite, but it's kind of worked out. And now I do various things, including supporting small businesses at board level. So, and one of those is Replan. So it's very nice to be here today.
Thanks very much, gents. Delighted to have you here. My name's Kevin O'Flynn. I'm sales director at Replan. I spent about 15 years in manufacturing, including a PhD at one stage, before moving on to the software vendor side. So I lead most of our conversations with supply chain directors as they're talking about their supply chain ambitions. And so what we're trying to do here is distill down some of those learnings that we've gotten from those many conversations that we've had. So as Steve and Shabbir said, we work for Replan. We're a supply chain software vendor, really focused on supporting planners in the supply planning space. So I know many of you may not have heard of us, so we've got a very short video to set the context for the kinds of challenges that we're going to address today, and also talks a little bit about Replan. Hopefully it works. jump back one there. So, Steve, we've been deliberately quite controversial in the title of the talk today. The supply planning is dead. Is it?
I know it sounds quite provocative, Kevin, but I think the answer is a resounding yes, it is. And in my opinion, I think it's probably been dead for some time, certainly in its current format. You know, we've seen a lot of turbulent times recently, and I think that's just highlighted it a lot more. You know, the technology most manufacturers are using is outdated, it's inefficient, and quite frankly, it's not fit for purpose. You know, many companies I see have built their people and process mix around technology that was developed 20 or 30 years ago. There's an acceptance that technology is not good enough, so consequently, developments in people and process has been held back. And it almost feels a bit like that's just the way it is, so that's the way we have to do it. And I think the planning department in most manufacturers, Kevin, is run by individuals made up spreadsheets on their laptops, and that's simply not efficient in the modern world.
And Shabbir, you've run planning departments like that. You've been ahead of planning. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with Steve. Steve talks about technology, and I've been in situations where companies have spent tens of millions on ERPs, in some cases hundreds of millions, and on planning systems as well. My experience of where I've worked is that as soon as the project team goes away, a little bit of time passes, you're still using your spreadsheets, to do all your value add stuff. And that's the space that I've been living in more or less more of my life. There isn't any time that's released to kind of bolster the medium or long term, so to actually do proper end-to-end planning. And we talk about that. I mean, our title is quite provocative. Supply planning is dead. Long live supply planning. And hopefully during the next few minutes, you'll see what that means. True planning is, as Steve says, been dead. It has been for some time. For example, when I was at Coca-Cola with Steve, it was kind of institutionalized to kind of accept the fact that you couldn't actually plan for the medium or long term. And the planner's job was basically sending out plan changes, managing the here and now. That's the way it has been all my working life, actually, to be honest. That is what a planner does. And when you have time, you look at the medium and the long term. But that's where all the value is.
Steve, why has it ended up here?
Well, if I reinforce what I've already touched on, the technology is outdated, and honestly, there's a tendency, I think, to just focus on the here and now. I know in most organisations, honestly, it's about can they get through this week. A lot of that, I think, has been exaggerated by COVID, and more recently, the supply chain stresses that everybody's seen. And the reality is short-term thinking. The endless search, and it's an endless search for reduced inventory, proliferation of SKUs, adding more complexity, have pretty much crippled the planning function. For years, we've heard about the need for being agile, flexible, and the CFOs, almost solely focused on lowering inventories. But that ultimately comes, at a big cost. And in supply chain, I firmly believe it's about a balance of the functions. And I think the balance has honestly been lost. But getting the planning function right, can unlock significant efficiency gains, improved customer service, and of course, unlock much needed cash. I've said this many times, Kevin. I talk to a lot of organisations, and I've said this many times. I think the planning function is the engine of the supply chain. And if the engine's not efficient, it ripples right through the whole supply chain. And I've seen that firsthand. I've been on the end of it. However, the good news is, despite our title, I don't think all is lost. I think the planning function needs to be put back into the sort of heart of the supply chain. And investment is desperately needed in bespoke technology, which has now become available. and it is only really recently that that's become available, to give the planners the tools they desperately need. And it's exactly why, when I first took over the supply chain in CCEP, the first thing I did was initiated a transformation project in planning. And the reason for that is I knew we had to fix the engine.
And you mentioned agility and the need for planning teams to focus. So there's a lot of talk about companies being able to gain supply chain agility by focusing purely on the short term. Is that where planning teams should be focusing?
I can see why people are talking about, coping with disruption, and I think the buzzword nowadays seems to be responding rapidly. I hear that a lot. And of course, manufacturers should execute plans to their best of their ability and be able to respond to change. However, it's not the be-all and end-all. I do not think it's acceptable to expect manufacturing plants to be given more than 100 short-term plan changes in a single week. And people recognise that out there. And this guy used to do it to me when I ran the factories, but I still talk to him. But if you do that to manufacturing sites and you expect them to deliver a high level of planned adherence and a high level of customer service, you're kidding yourself. And as I say, I speak from personal experiences, and they're not made up numbers. They're real numbers, or they were real numbers. It's back to the point I said earlier. It's why in CCEP I radically changed the planning function, as I knew there was a better way to balance the functions of supply chain and make them work much more in harmony. However, as we've touched on, it requires investment, both time and money, to do those type transformations. And there is a part of this that requires giving the planners the tools to do the job.
Yeah, I didn't enjoy sending Steve and his team all those plan changes, as you can imagine. This is the point that I was making earlier on. Planners shouldn't think that's their job, is to send out plan changes. If you'd have talked to me when I was at Coke, I would have basically argued against you and said, well, of course plans change. And clearly we're not here to tell you that plans don't change, but it shouldn't be the case where basically you overhaul a plan after 10 minutes and throw it in the bin. It is soul destroying for planners to live that sort of mode of operation, and the businesses suffer as a consequence. So that's what short-term planning does.
So we've got time for Q&A later on. I'm sure the experiences the guys have talked about resonates with lots of you in the audience. We'd love to hear your experiences on that side. But I guess continuing on this line then, Steve, what's the impact of this focus on short-term planning on organisations?
As I said earlier, I've seen it firsthand, the impact of not just short-term planning, but also the impact of updating, legacy ERP systems from the sort of simple homegrown ones to one of the more popular ones available today. And honestly, if you get it wrong, it can destroy your supply chain. And I can vouch for that because I've been there. There's no fun in watching customer service nosedive, watching your team struggle to get any kind of stability back, watching people work 14 hours a day to get a half-decent plan out, and the impact that this has on morale is quite devastating. And the outcome of all of that is tens of millions lost in revenue and business disruption. So it's critical to avoid it. And if you're in that situation, and I know quite a number of businesses are, my advice is step in, take some bold action, build a strong team, and rebuild the planning function. And it's no easy task, don't get me wrong, but it needs to be done. And I'll repeat, Kevin, what I said earlier, we need to put the planning function right back at the heart of the supply chain. And you give them the technology that they desperately need.
And Shabbir, you've been ahead of planning. Can you share your perspective?
Absolutely, and we don't want to labour the point about short, medium and long-term planning actually, but it's important to and this will probably be the last slide on this actually, but if you look at the business impact, which is basically the question, there is real impact in short-term focus. Basically, you're looking at your competition. They come in, and if you don't have a kind of a medium or long-term focus, clearly they come in and kind of take your market share. New products, if you're an FMCG, heavily focused on portfolio sort of renewal, you're trying to enrich your portfolio and introduce new products, and they might not get the attention that they need, and consequently they fail in the marketplace. Key supply chain decisions like changing shift patterns or invoking co-packing or co-manufacturing, those decisions don't get made on time. And if you're a kind of a seasonal business, like let's say Technical Sugars was, looking at Pancake Day and of course Easter and Christmas, there are key stock targets that you need to hit for by SKU or by a group of SKUs, and if you didn't focus on the medium and long term, the business impact is that you will not actually achieve your target, and consequently, you'll be shorting customers. So, Steve has kind of touched on it already. The supply planning team ends up burning the midnight oil to kind of balance conflicting priorities. If you look at what's happened during the COVID times, it's been crystallized, where planning teams are exerting superhuman effort, trying to kind of manage the short-term issues that they're having to cope with. The technology underinvestment has forced them into this sort of mode of operation. It's probably highlighted the issue more than anything else. And now people more than ever are stuck in manual mode in Excel, even if they don't like admitting to it.
So given the challenges and the problems that a focus on short-term planning causes, looking ahead then, what does a much more effective supply planning process look like?
Well, an ineffective planning process would be the one that looks at the short term. And I'll give you an example actually of an effective planning process, and I probably embarrassed the Technical Sugar guys over there actually, but Keith was my mentor there when we were there, and we worked together, and of course Ben, and we worked together on trying to use S&OP principles to look at the short, medium and long term. So this will be sort of the key elements of a supply planning process that need to come out. Despite the technology, despite everything else, one of the key things that certainly Keith targeted us with was, look, we have to get clarity around the short, medium and the long term. And that played really well. Admittedly, it was very, very hard actually, but by giving the focus on the short, medium and long term, the sort of feedback that we got from the area president was that there was a certain amount of clarity and calm that came out of the planning department. So on the surface, that was the feedback, but the problem was that the likes of me and my team were working basically till midnight, and I used to exchange emails with Keith actually at midnight, is it ready yet, is it ready yet? That's not a mode of operation that you want for your team, okay? You have to treat your people in a different way, and you have to look at technology in a different way.
So I think if you flick to the next slide. So what does a classic supply chain look like, and how should you transform it?
Well, I think if you look at, again, I go backward to the Technical Sugar example, the focus on the short, medium and long term and the clarity of issues. These are the sort of things that you need to bring out. But classically, in a kind of a planning process would be sales and operations execution, S&OP, and an element of long-term or strategic planning. And these are classic sort of planning processes, but they're disconnected. And ultimately, a planning process, an effective planning process, would in effect connect all these. So you're working from the same sort of hymn sheet, the same plan. So there's no short-term plan that's different to the medium-term or the long-term plan. So connected supply chains, connected sort of processes are very, very key.
And Steve, you mentioned needing to do a transformation project in planning when you were in Coke. Is this what you were trying to achieve?
Yeah, the transformation project, when we called it transformation project, and it was very much focused on getting that balance in supply chain and stability back in the supply chain. If there's not balance in your supply chain, it flip-flops. And flip-flopping in supply chain is not good. We put a massive focus on stock availability, at a manufacturing and dispatch site level, and that was a big change for us. You know, traditionally you'd focus on customer service, but if you go down and you focus on stock availability, you get customer service. And that required planning stability, and that required a shift to looking at the medium term, not just the short term. I mean, Shabbir touched on it. You know, implement an S&OP properly at demand, supply, and executive level was also fundamental for us. And again, that was a big shift. And one of my ex-colleagues of CCEP is in the room, and I guess they're still doing it. I hope so. You know, what I see is out there as I go around is organisations tend to, you know, really focus on short-term planning, and they think, well, if I keep focused on the short-term planning, that's what's going to happen tomorrow and the next day, and I think it's wrong. I think if you want to build stability, you have to focus much more heavily on your mid-term planning cycle. Equally, as I touched on, you know, S&OP has to be done rigorously, or if not, don't do it, because you'll be wasting your time. And, you know, for example, in CCEP, you know, we used to dedicate a whole full day a month to executive S&OP. But the implications or the impact of going through that level of change and transformation was improved customer service. I would say balanced inventories, so not lower, but balanced inventories. Definitely stability back at plant level and dispatch site level. Significantly less in-week short-term plan changes from that 100 we talked about earlier. And a very, very high level of stock availability at day 1 to day 4 level, which was a very important metric for us. And, you know, the output of all of that tends to be that your commercial teams are happy. And if your commercial teams are happy, generally the supply chain will be happy, because it's nice when you're all happy together rather than, you know, blaming each other for the next crisis.
So Shabbir, that's maybe a lofty vision of getting the entire supply chain happy with each other. What kind of capabilities are needed for the people in the room to be thinking about to be able to deliver that?
Well, actually, it would have been nice to kind of have stuck around and kind of see that sea change in planning in Coca-Cola. So, absolutely, yeah. One of the capabilities, I think, Steve did touch on it earlier on. There needs to be a change in the mindset from the supply chain exec. Steve, as the exec, I mean, he talked about the S&OP, but he told me that he actually spent a day with the supply chain exec, or with the S&OP exec meeting. So that was the sort of commitment that was required from the exec. But essentially, to kind of the processes that we talked about, the short, medium, and long term, the commitment has to be from the exec is to kind of knit those sort of processes together, so you actually have one plan. And you need to enable the right technology. And we've been talking about technology quite a lot. Now that facilitates the approach and doesn't force the planners into a kind of a different modules depending on what horizon you're actually looking at. So there needs to be just the one platform, and that's very key. And you also need to make the enterprise capable of doing, and this is probably going to be evocative as well, actually, but continuous planning. Again, this is technology related, and we can talk about that during the Q&A session, but continuous planning across the short, medium, and long-term horizon is a bit of a sea change, actually, when it comes to capabilities.
And Steve, from an operational perspective, what kind of capabilities are you looking for?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can keep it quite brief, but, you know, I think the bottom line is, you know, you need the right processes in place. You definitely need highly trained people, and I think one of the shameful things about COVID is that people have let training slip quite a lot, you know, and it needs to be brought back. And without question, using tools that are fit for purpose is really, really important. I think the ability now to scenario plan is something that's quite new, and it's, you know, and I think it's becoming more essential in your planning function to be able to scenario plan, because situations in supply chain arise pretty much on a daily basis, but certainly big situation, crises as such, can arise all the time, and you may need to change, your plan. And I emphasise the word may, because that's a key word. Too often in planning functions you see knee-jerk reactions, and it just adds more disruption, and it generally causes another issue down the road. And I've honestly seen this 1,000 times. And whenever Shabbir and I used to fall out, it was normally around a situation like that. But let's be really, really honest. How many planning teams have the right technology available to them to be able to make the right decisions quickly? Quickly make the right decisions. And honestly, how many have the right tools to be able to do that without relying on gut instinct? Gut instinct, I think, has driven planning for far too long. And I guess, being provocative again, honestly, I see companies out there and they spend millions of pounds with the big consulting firms doing strategic reviews. And we've all been there, and we've all done these strategic reviews. I just urge companies, when I'm talking to companies, I urge companies to spend that money in a much more important place, which is giving the front line of your supply chain the tools they desperately need so they can do, a world-class job day in, day out.
Shabbir, if you go to the next slide. So this is a framework slide that I often use when I'm talking to supply chain execs around how their planners are trying to balance between three core components: the availability of stock, which you've spoken about a lot, Steve, the capacity utilization, and the inventory. And what we find from most organizations, or from many organizations, is that with that short-term focus, their planners tend to land on one of these three pieces. They're either prioritizing the stock availability that you mentioned, or they're trying to prioritize maximizing OEE by overemphasizing capacity utilization. But what they really would prefer to be able to do is to look at the impact of moving that balance around that entire surface. So not always prioritizing capacity and then sacrificing your availability and your inventory, or prioritizing availability and sacrificing the other two. So the technology point that Steve and Shabbir are making is that the technology is available today to support planners to make very, very quick decisions that can include very complex data and scenarios behind it. That's allowing them to find not just a single balance, but to understand the impact and trade-off of moving around that complete surface. So that's the advantage of technology, is you're combining the speed of decisions that you currently have, but giving planners the support to be able to understand the implication of those different decisions that they're making. So if you can go to the next slide. We've talked about the impact and the costs. How do organizations go about delivering these kinds of capabilities to support their planners?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So essentially there are three components, ultimately, to deliver these capabilities. There is no silver bullet, by the way. I mean, it's a really tough nut to crack, and people have been planning in a certain way for the last 20, 30 years, stuck in Excel or legacy systems. And we already heard, of course, it's a balancing act, and it's really difficult to do it manually. I mean, even if you throw loads of people at it, and we can talk about examples of that as well, actually, but the key thing is you have to take a different approach. And that approach is that you need to be able to create an accurate digital twin of your manufacturing environment. And you also need to enable optimization so that dynamic solutions are available in minutes, not in weeks. For instance, I mean, if you look at Google Maps, if you veer off track, it gives you a solution straight away. Just imagine that applied to supply planning. Wouldn't you kind of be, kind of an SNOB meeting, have a question about a demand that might have doubled, or some sort of an issue around manufacturing or whatever, feed that into a box of tricks or something, or some sort of a tool, this technology, to give you that answer in a meeting, rather than your next SNOP meeting is going to be about 4 weeks' time. Okay? And in terms of the planning process, what you need to do is to implement a process that utilizes these capabilities. We like to think of it as orchestrating the supply chain. And it's a bit grandiose, actually, orchestrating the supply chain. But I go back to, what I said earlier on about the short, medium, and long-term clarity and the calm that you get as a consequence of having a joined-up sort of system. If you're able to give, that clarity, you'll get the calm within the supply chain. So that comes through the right process.
So maybe you can tell us pretty quickly about what is a digital twin?
So we're going to get into a little bit of detail there, actually, right? So you've all heard this Industry 4.0 sort of term bandied about. Digital twin sits in that space, and a lot of you will actually intellectually make a leap in terms of what a digital twin is. But essentially, what you're trying to do, as I said, is you're trying to create some sort of rendition of your manufacturing environment, looking at capturing the operational realities and constraints. And Excel and legacy systems are not digital twins. They kind of force you to make simplifying sort of assumptions and don't accurately represent what's happening in the factory. I mean, myself, I tried to configure SAP APO, failed miserably. I couldn't do it. Some of you may try and actually succeeded, but ultimately I don't regard SAP APO as a tool for the future, especially within this planning space, what we're talking about here. The fact that I couldn't make it work, and our SAP IBP was leaps and bounds an improvement in terms of SAP APO, but essentially it forced you more into manual working, basically Excel spreadsheets. So you didn't really get the sort of process gains, or you might have thought you had because it's probably easier, but I certainly didn't. So, I mean, one of the challenges, I suppose, this is a little bit of detail actually, as within planning, is trying to understand what's happening upstream, so you can forecast and you can supply plan and you can schedule finished case goods, but what's happening upstream within the process area. They still need a schedule, they still need some long-term thinking. When I say they, the process engineers that are working in the factory, and they're creating offline plans as well. So this digital twin seeks to kind of map out all sorts of those sort of processes. And I've got a nice little chart here for you, if I can bring it up. This is an example of a digital twin that we've built for a crisp manufacturer. It's a 5-stage process. I won't go into all the detail. You can come and see me later on and we can talk about this and see it in action. But essentially, this is end-to-end crisp manufacturing. Now, you've got your sort of all the different stages, and you've got the packing stage as well, and you've got the sort of inbound materials as well. The key thing is this exists in one system. This is your digital twin. And the other key thing is, rather than a process engineer working out, some sort of a frying sort of schedule or a seasonal sort of seasoning schedule of sorts and everything else, what you do is you create the digital twin, all the essential parameters like run rates and changeovers from product and to product, and the like. And you can actually supply plan each one of these stages. Right? So rather than having a finished goods stock strategy, you can have a stock strategy for anything upstream. That's what a digital twin needs to enable you to do.
And then if you layer AI on top of that, then Shabbir, what do you get?
You get optimization, ultimately. Okay, I'll talk about this. So all of this you can put onto an Excel spreadsheet and have as a model and offline and everything else, actually, but it's a very, very difficult to kind of make it work. So we talk about technology quite a lot, and you probably hear this term. I actually heard it for the first time. Actually, I was listening to Radio 4, infocalypse. Yeah? I don't know whether that's an actual standard term. I don't know whether the guy was actually being interviewed and made it up on the spot, but it kind of resonated with me. And he was talking about AI. You're bringing dead people back to life using AI. There you go. Quite grandiose, right? You can, I mean, that's what AI is enabling you to do, is, dead actors, back up on screen again. AI is in your phones. We talk about Google Maps and everything else. That's the technology that everybody else is benefiting from. This apocalypse that's taking place is going to engulf everybody in the next couple of years. It's been happening up until now. Everybody else is benefiting from it. We've spent the last 20, 30 years, certainly I have, scratching spreadsheets as a planner. I used to have a full head of hair, by the way, all right? This is what planning does to you, a lifetime. You need AI. You need a different approach. And other people are benefiting from it. I think it's high time the supply planning did.
Yeah, part of the challenge is that when you're trying to model a system as complex as this in Excel or in, say, older technologies, is that the complexity exceeds what the technology is capable of supporting the planner to do. AI is a perfect example of being able to take a challenging, complex problem like that and give you the right answer and give it to you very, very quickly. And if you go to the next slide, that's where we start to use that availability, capacity, and inventory framework. It's combining that concept with a complex digital supply chain enables planners to not just look at the packaging step, but to look at the impact across their complete supply chain. And I'm conscious we're almost out of time, so if you go on to the next slide. So what does that mean for customers in practice where they've been able to implement a solution like that using the capabilities that we've talked about? So building a very lightweight digital twin of their process, layering AI optimization on top of that. It means that we're doing a much more connected job of planning their processes, which allows them then to prioritize and to balance between availability, capacity, and inventory. So this is an example of a customer that's using a very, very common ERP and their planning module. When they were trying to do that midterm planning process that Shabbir was talking about, they had to do that offline in Excel and spreadsheets. They did a lot of the short-term focus, but that wasn't delivering them the business results that they were looking for. So we're using our solution in parallel with their existing ERP, built that little digital twin, and it allows us to transform their mid and long-term planning. That means that the plans that we're dropping into their short-term planning are pre-optimized. They're balancing between their different priorities. The overall impact is that we've been able to optimize the production sequence so that they're making the right products at the right time, at the right location. We're creating additional capacity on their line so they can either bring products that they're currently co-manufacturing in-house, or they can make additional products since they're capacity constrained. And the net impact on the organization is a potential increase in up to £10 million for them. So that's the kind of advantage that AI can give you and the capabilities that we've talked about today. What I'd like to do is to, since we're almost out of time, is maybe to give the closing word over to Steve.
Yeah, probably three things, if you take anything from this discussion today. I mean, let's go back to the original question, which was, is planning dead? And I think the answer to that is yes, but it doesn't have to be. You have to decide that if it's the engine of the supply chain, which I think it is, that you're going to go out and you're going to fix the engine. I think the second thing is you have to put planning back into the sort of heart of the supply chain. It's not some back office function that kind of ticks along in the background and you just hope it spits out the right thing. It's got to be much more important than that. And I think finally, invest in some of these bespoke tools that are now available. Now, if you're in a big organisation, you're going to bump into the procurement team. I know that from first hand. Nothing against the procurement team. If there's any procurement people in the room, procurement people add huge value to organisations. But when you go to the procurement team and you say, we've evaluated this great system and we really think it would help our frontline people, the response you'll get is, but we have a strategic partnership with some big supplier who does not specialise in these areas. And you kind of have to punch through that and get what you want. You know, you have to be bold in life and you have to get what you want. And give your frontline people the tools they need. Because if you do, they'll embrace them and they'll deliver a result for you.
Great. Thank you, gents. Hopefully that's been... You can hold your applause for a second. I just want to turn out to the audience. Hopefully that's been some good food for thought for you. We'd love to get your perspectives on if you're facing similar challenges or if you've got any questions for us. And we've got 5 minutes for questions.
I got two.
Please.
So the first one is obviously this technology would enable planners to do the work in a different way. how do you think of the impact of the planning organization as such? Do you see that planners are going to have a larger scope, or what have you experienced in that space as they implement these systems?
Yeah, I can answer that actually. So it's within the gift of the organisation to change with the times. If you invest in this sort of technology or this sort of practice, you enable AI, clearly it's going to have an impact on your people. And you're going to go into exceptions management, you're going to orchestration. A lot of the drudgery of spreadsheets is taken away because all that's done for you, more or less. So whether your current people who are institutionalized in a certain way of thinking, whether they can make the leap in adding value, right, in your kind of a short, medium, and long term, that's up to management to calibrate. But clearly the role changes. The role is very much into by exception management, but it's basically orchestration. To get that clarity and calm, you need a different breed of planner, potentially. There's different skill sets because you need good stakeholder management skills, good planning skills, and good sort of effective meeting skills. Those sort of elements you need to bring in as a criteria and calibrate that against your organization to give you the direction that you need. But clearly, you already embarked on a change, and part of that change journey is going to be to kind of invest in your people.
Thank you. The other one I had also is that with this, do you introduce any new KPIs for the planning organization, or are they the classical KPIs we hold it on to, or?
Yeah.
It's an interesting debate, I would say, and it depends on what makes sense for the organization. We use the ACI framework to try and get some baseline KPIs. We typically don't have to introduce new ones. We'll try and ensure that we're optimizing against the existing KPIs because they're often shared throughout the organization. So if planning starts to create their own set of unique KPIs that are independent of everybody else, you don't end up with a connected organization, which is what we're trying to promote.
There is one actually that if you're going to take anything away in terms of KPI, basically if you look at scenario planning, which this technology and this mode of operation enables you to kind of enable, scenario planning in minutes rather than weeks. It's not just a marketing ploy, it's basically here to stay, and that's what we're propagating. So you need to be able to understand the quality of that particular scenario. And you have to be able to compare one plan against the other. And one of the key things as a planner is stock at risk or SKUs at risk in the sort of the short, medium, and long-term horizon. You need to be able to have that as a KPI to kind of calibrate the different plans, to give the planners that tool to be able to propose, something that's already been validated or quality checked against a set of KPIs. Okay.
Do you see evidence when you take an AI approach versus maybe one of the legacy or more traditional planning approaches, the acceptance of the plan as you go from maybe like a monthly to a weekly to a daily, and you have the handoff then onto the operational side and you get into scheduling? Do you see an increased acceptance of the plans coming in, or do you still see a lot of plans getting ripped up and then schedulers going off and doing their own thing?
I would say anytime someone talks about AI, explainability is always going to be a key component of that, because it can occasionally suggest something that doesn't gel well with the planner's normal experience. So anytime that happens and we dig into it, there's always a good reason why, and it can be counterintuitive, but it's a great way to try and stretch a planner's thinking around what should be possible and what makes sense. What we find is that when we do head-to-heads against existing solutions, the feasibility of the plan that we can output using AI in a digital twin is significantly better than what you'll get out of a legacy system. So what you'd often find in let's say the module that's doing the planning and then dropping into the scheduling, is that module is probably doing rough capacity planning, so it's unlikely that the plan that it drops into the scheduling horizon is going to be feasible for that week. So the planners are constantly trying to rework those plans. What we see is by building a more accurate digital twin and dropping a feasible plan into the short term, you're removing a significant amount of manual work that the scheduler has to do. It's a much easier job to run that optimization on that short-term schedule. So that's how you start to build credibility in the organization, is by showing them plans that are dropping into their hands that are pre-optimized and are feasible.
Yeah.
I'll just comment on that because I'm a bit passionate about this. In my time, I've introduced quite a few data systems and systems. And what tends to happen is you introduce it and you go through your initial commissioning sort of testing phase, and people are sceptical. And what happens is after 6 months, you think you're there, and then you walk into a head office in the planning team, or you walk into a plant, and there's all these legacy Excel sheets and systems that they used to use, and everyone says, oh, you see, I don't trust the new system. I don't think the data's right. And I think you have to be really solid. And you have to say, if the data's not right, we fix the data. And we're relentless about fixing the data until it's right, because you're going to have to trust the data, because all your Excel sheets and all your legacy systems have to be turned off. I was recently working with a large manufacturing plant in Scotland, and they had 2 systems running, a new system which was far superior than their old system. It was an OEE system, but they kept pulling back to the old system. And in the end, we convinced the supply chain director to say, on this date, the old system gets turned off. IT are coming in, and they're turning it off. And that was the quickest way that they adapted the new system. And I really, I can guarantee if you introduce new systems, people will fall back on their old systems until you turn them off. And you have to be bold and turn them off, even if it's not quite right, because they'll make it right then.
I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for your time and attention. We're here all day if you'd like to catch any one of us if you've got any further questions. And thank you very much.